afternoon. I'm very, very pleased and very excited to be here and to try to present you this consistent and very ambitious scenario for France with a focus on the role of energy sufficiency in that scenario. Maybe I should start by a very quick words on the négaWatt group, which is a French NGO of experts with over 1,000 members, but a core of 25 experts very much involved in developing this scenario and developing policies and measures. It's been created in 2001 and still growing and working. And our work is basically built on an approach which we call a global intelligence approach for energy, which is a three-step approach, which starts with working on energy services, and that is what we call sufficiency, of course, reducing the needs of energy services to what energy services are really useful for. Then, of course, the intelligence and all technical modes, so the efficiency over all the energy supply chain, and last but not least, substitution of fossil and fissile energies by renewables. We tend to talk more of stock-based and flow-based energies rather than fossil and fissile and renewables. To be a little more detailed on what we call sufficiency and efficiency, so we start with sufficiency. As I said, it's about reducing the need to use energy down to the satisfaction of really useful needs and well-set energy services. That includes different kinds of sufficiency, and maybe this is something we could discuss later on. Dimensional sufficiency, which is all that goes with the size, the nominal capacity of equipments that we use. The servicial sufficiency, which is about the intensity of duration and duration of use of the equipments, and some organizational sufficiency, which is a very broad issue and very complex one. But that includes sharing some equipments, but also some collective planning, for instance, urban planning. And once we've done this work on sufficiency, we can go for efficiency. I won't get into the details of it, just to mention that we try to address both the efficiency of the energy transformation chain from the from the useful energy to the primary energy, but we also try to address the gray energy and the life cycle energy of the equipments involved. Before I tell you what the French négaWatt scenario looks like, I should, I think, say a very few words on the French energy situation. We have a dependency on fossil fuel, which is lower than the world average. The world average is about 80%. We are 70% in terms of final energy dependency on fossil fuels in France. For that reason, we have a level of greenhouse gas emissions which is lower than most economically comparable countries, but still very much higher than sustainable levels. And for that reason, back in 2005, France set in an energy bill an objective of fourfold reduction of French greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which is still in force. We have a strong dependency, of course, on nuclear power for electricity and a low and slow development of renewables. And in that context, the négaWatt scenario that we produced in 2011 aimed to, try to feed the energy policy debate with a sustainable pathway towards low carbon and 100% renewables. Strategy shows the possibility of a step-by-step implementation of energy transition, and we prepared it in the context of the then presidential election to come in 2012, but it's fair to say that our work was boosted in terms of influence and importance in the debate by the Fukushima catastrophe and the impact it had on the French energy debate. The fundamentals of the scenario are to try to, well, it's a normative implementation of our négaWatt approach, as I described it. But it's not a normative scenario in the sense that we don't start with predefined objectives in terms of level of energy to reach or level of greenhouse gas emissions to reach by 2050, which is the horizon of our scenario. We start from today, so it's an open scenario in that sense, but it's normative in the sense that we try to implement every year, each year after year, this approach, this hierarchy of options, sufficiency, efficiency, and renewable substitution. This, of course, means that we try to avoid in the scenario the replacement of the existing nuclear power plants by new nuclear power plants. We exclude CCS, and we also exclude shale gas, which was a very hot topic at the time when we produced this scenario. One important methodological choice we make is that of so-called technological realism, meaning that we don't want to introduce technologies that are not existing on the market or mature enough to go for the market. This is, of course, a very strong limitation because we know that some disruptions will happen, but as we don't know what they would be and we don't know what role they could play, we are very much more comfortable with a trajectory that works without those disruptions than if we really would, if we would depend on disruptions to get to a sustainable situation. And finally, we address, of course, the climate issue, but we try to develop a broader, sustainable approach addressing all the impacts of energy production and consumption. The definition that we set for ourselves of sustainable energy policy is trying to transfer revenues rather than debts to future generations. The reason for developing a scenario is that we need this to bring long-term concerns into short-term decisions. So we need to get a trajectory to work on. We need to both get a long-term vision that we agree on and a step-by-step pathway to get to that long-term vision. This, of course, is definitely needed to work on policies and measures. And another strong methodological point that we stick to is to work with a purely energy model without any euro in it, and then discuss the economics, because what we see is that the economics don't put us on a fully sustainable trajectory, so we put it the other way around. We work on a physical trajectory that works, and then we question the economics that would make it work. I won't say much about the model we use, simply to say that along with our approach, it starts with energy services, heat, mobility, specific electricity. We look into those uses into all economic sectors. We implement sufficiency and efficiency that leads us to a final energy demand. We look at all transformations through the system up to primary energy demand. And we develop renewables according to realistic potential, phase out nuclear power and reduce fossil fuels accordingly. And I should also say that our model includes, although I won't talk further about it, a power balance for electricity on a hourly basis, while the overall energy model is on a yearly basis. Well, I think I could skip that. I already said the horizon of the scenario is 2050. We work only with one population hypothesis, which is the central official one from the French government. We work on within the boundaries of metropolitan France, and of course we needed to develop a trend or business as usual scenario, which is in the context of the time, just after the Grenelle de l'environnement in France, somehow a flat energy scenario. Going into some details of the scenario, although obviously time is lacking to tell you about it in very much detail, but going through the energy consumption sectors and starting with the buildings, because of course it's the most important one in absolute terms. Some of the developments looked for in the scenario include moderating surfaces per person, moderating surfaces of the tertiary sector. Of course, building positive energy new buildings, but that, as you know, is not enough. So the scenario includes a very deep and large thermal retrofitting program, but focusing on some sufficiency items. We describe an evolution where average surface per person is stabilized in housings, and the growth of tertiary surfaces is limited. For surfaces per person, this includes, for instance, recohabitation policies, because we see a trend to decohabitation. So this could, for instance, be a joint tenancy for students. Priority to small collective buildings compared to the trend for more and more individual houses. Priority to multifunctional buildings. So this is the kind of things we try to implement to stabilize surfaces, but the sufficiency also includes things like efforts on heating levels, efforts on hot water needs, and other kinds of things. For specific electricity, and that corresponds to one remark that was made previously, we simply imagine that we would get, on average, in 2050, what we see as the best performance of equipments and behavior today. Simply getting to that on average, plus a provision for new uses. I mean, there are a lot of detailed things on the rate of use of appliances, the limited growth of their capacity, the rate of equipments of households, the limitation of public lighting. I mean, we implement sufficiency and efficiency on a case-by-case basis for more than 20 different uses in the residential sector and 10 in the tertiary sector. For the transports, which is a very hard bit, we really try to play with all the means for action for reducing consumption, from urban planning to reduce the need for distances to get to the same services. Of course, modal transfer. Of course, also increasing the efficiency of vehicles, increasing the adaptation of the vehicles we use to different uses. And when it comes to some examples of sufficiency, leading in that scenario to a slow decrease of distances per person per year and a slow decrease of the freight volumes. That includes, for instance, working on urban planning, like putting some conditions on development of new buildings relating to the proximity to existing infrastructures and existing services, so that we develop buildings and we develop new activities where density is already there, and not developing new things and then trying to get the infrastructures to reach them, like network infrastructures. Mixity of uses, co-working spaces, more local production and consumption loops, of course, and also different things like car sharing, speed limitation, reduction of plane traffic, because due to this methodological choice of not introducing any disruption, we don't have any solution for renewable-based plane travel, so we have to reduce it. And finally, the industry sector includes an extended recycling of materials, because usually this uses less energy than producing new tons of raw material. Reduced need of goods, efficiency in manufacturing processes, of course, and although we try to reduce the energy consumption in industry, we introduce some relocalization of production, because one of our concerns is the trend to rapid increase of the French carbon footprint, although domestic emissions are going down. In terms of sufficiency, it's again a case-by-case analysis to reduce the need for primary and secondary goods. That includes, for instance, end of paper publicity, which accounts for 35% reduction of the need for paper production. Limited growth of equipment rates for electric appliances. Reduction of replacement rates again, with some repair and reuse policies. And also reduced need of things like bitumen, iron, and other materials in relation to the evolution of the transport sector, the evolution of the building sector, and so on. Altogether, this, applying all these efficiency and sufficiency items, brings the overall final energy consumption of all sectors down by 50% by 2050 compared to 2010 levels. And when it comes to sufficiency, because obviously this is very much discussed and challenged by some French stakeholders, we very much insist on the fact that the behavior changes that we describe between 2011 and 2050 are not stronger than those we experienced over 1971 to 2020. I mean, the changes are not stronger. The difference is that we don't let those changes happen. We need to have them driven by long-term constraints. But the changes in themselves, they are not that dramatic. And finally, a small word on agriculture. It's not very important from a purely energy consumption point of view, but of course it's important in terms of overall greenhouse gas emissions, and it's also important in terms of getting some biomass available for energy uses. We are very lucky to combine our work with négaWatt on the energy policy, on an energy scenario, with the work done by another NGO called Solagro, and its scenario is called After 2050, and it develops roughly the same approach on the agricultural sector, including some change of food habits, for instance, reducing by 50% by 2050 the share, the quantity of meat we eat. But this also allows for sustainable sustainable use of bioenergy in the négaWatt scenario. So when it comes to developing the use of renewables, well, we seek for a realistic but voluntarist but realistic development of renewables. We very much insist on the fact that electric renewables will develop, and that is in a sense the easy part, but we need very much to develop other renewables, and in particular biomass. We don't see too much development of biofuels, we prefer to represent the development of biogas, including in transports. And all this development allows for phasing out the use of the 58 French reactors altogether before they reached their 40 years initial design lifetime, and not phasing out the use of fossil fuels, but really reducing it to some residual uses. The share of sufficiency and efficiency, I can't go into detail there, but I just want to emphasize that it's very different depending on the uses. I mean, for heat, mobility, and specific electricity, the share, I mean, you might not see very well the efficiency there and sufficiency there. It's the other way around for the mobility, with sufficiency playing a very important role and much bigger than efficiency, and their roles are roughly the same for specific electricity. This is mostly due to the size, to the capacity of changing equipment, so the role that efficiency could play, and the need to change uses to compensate. And especially, again, in mobility, the sufficiency is really key to get to our objectives. You could also see that in all those uses, there's a change which doesn't happen at the same time, but which altogether results in renewables fulfilling almost all of the uses by 2050. This is just to to show off a bit, but more seriously to give you an insight of the level of details we get into in the scenarios. This is the Sankey diagram of the French energy system in 2010, with fossil fuel there, uranium here, and all the renewables for the heat, final uses, mobility, and specific electricity. And this is just how it changes between 2010 and 2050. The overall primary energy balance is compared to our trend flat scenario to get to a situation where renewables could account for more than 90% of primary energy, of fulfilling primary energy demand, thanks to a 2/3 reduction in primary energy consumption. And we really insist on that because, as I said, the development of renewables that we represent is, in our view, still realistic but very voluntarist. So we don't think that we could get to much more renewables by 2050 than what we represent, which means that if we don't make all this effort, including this important share of sufficiency there, we don't get to a level of consumption where renewables could provide almost 100%. The overall balance in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is for what we really represent in the model, which is CO2 emissions related to energy production and use. We get to a 16-fold reduction of CO2, energy-related CO2 emissions. And we say that it's important to get to that level because we can't get to levels of fourfold. Remember, our objective to get to a sustainable level in France is fourfold reduction by 2050 of all greenhouse gas emissions. You can't get fourfold in other sectors. You can hardly get to twofold reduction of the agriculture greenhouse gas emissions, for instance. So you need to implement much more than 75% reduction in energy. And altogether, sorry, the scenario when we try to estimate the other emissions and the emissions of other sectors, it gets us to division by 5 of all French greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This has not been done by négaWatt, but by a group of experts as part of the French national energy debate on energy transition in 2012 and 13. We also tried to look at cumulated CO2 emissions over the scenario and to look whether they are in line with the 2 degrees world, with the French share of fair share of a 2 degrees scenario, and they are just in line, actually, or they were just in line in 2011. But we know that the cumulative emission that France could, the French share of the world carbon budget is less now than what we could assume in 2011. So this scenario won't be enough today to meet a French fair share of a 2 degrees trajectory, but still at that time, that was just in line with that objective. A few words on the economics. As I said, it's not included in the model, but we obviously try to develop something which makes economic sense. We are very much convinced that it is so because, for instance, this kind of trajectory means huge savings on the French energy bill, which reached up to 60 or 70 billion euros over the past years. We are talking of investments with predictable payback, especially when we talk about efficiency. And we think there's a long-term competitivity attached to that kind of trajectory because of the opposite trends of the long-term prices of fossil fuels and nuclear power compared to renewables. There was a study made by someone from CNRS on the jobs creations through a scenario like négaWatt, which ended up with the conclusion that it could create up to 600,000 jobs by 2030 compared to a business as usual scenario. And we had 2 runs by 2 different teams, one including ADEME, using their macroeconomic models. They gave positive results. We are very pleased with it, although, and we might discuss this later, we are not convinced at all by the result. I mean, this reinforced our conviction that these macroeconomic models can't actually represent the kind of energy and therefore economic transition we are talking about. But because we need positive macroeconomic results to convince decision makers, we were very pleased and we used those results. On conclusions and recommendations based on this scenario, well, based on existing and emerging solutions, it is possible to implement energy transition of a country like France to almost 100% renewables by 2050. This needs a strategy based on intelligent energy uses, technical solutions, and choices of resource. And this is obviously needed to meet ambitious climate objectives. In particular, energy-related CO2 emissions must be strongly reduced, which requires 50% reduction of the overall final energy consumption by 2050. We think our scenario shows this is reachable. And we also think the approach we propose is based on strong values of fairness, equity, minimum risks, and no regret path, and that the solutions we recommend from an energy and climate perspective have social and economic benefits. If I still have a few minutes, I'm not sure, just a few words about the political outcome of that work. I think we can say that this scenario played an important role in framing the French energy debate over the past few years. It was one of the 4 scenarios used as reference to discuss trajectory in this national debate on energy transition, which I referred to, and one of the 2 scenarios which meet the French greenhouse gas emissions targets, together with the ADEME scenario, which is actually very close to the négaWatt one and was published after the négaWatt scenario. The strategy, I mean, namely, the fact that energy transition is about sufficiency, efficiency, and developing renewables is introduced in Article 1 of the French energy transition law that resulted from that debate. And most of the objectives set by this Energy Transition Act are in line with the négaWatt scenario, and particularly the fact that we have now an objective to get 50% reduction by 2050 of French final energy consumption. And last but not least, what I told you about referred to a scenario that we published in 2011. That is now a long time ago. So we started earlier this year to work on a new one, which will be published in the beginning of next year. We did so because, well, we needed to update, of course, update the data of the starting year, update our understanding of potentials of efficiency, sufficiency, and renewables. We also need that to stay somehow at the forefront of the French energy debate. We also wanted a new scenario to get more involved in European and international discussions with other experts. I mean, we got very much involved in COP21, and we thought after it that we really need to develop collaborations with other experts in other countries to get into the debate on the NDCs and their level of ambitions. And finally, we wanted to improve some of the things we still think are not fully developed in our scenario, like further integrated urban planning, building and mobility, like working on the robustness to some disruption, to degraded climate conditions. Also thinking of what would be needed to get this scenario down to a 1.5 degrees trajectory for France, which probably calls for more sufficiency. And yeah, this is my really last word. And yeah, I just want to finish with a save the date announcement, because we're going to publish this scenario on 25th of January in Paris, and also in Bordeaux the next day. So you are kindly invited to join us that day. Thank you.